Nick, I think crisis is a great place to start with a leadership discussion because it brings out both the best and then subsequently the worst in people in leadership terms. Because it's such a compressed leadership period for people and requires slightly different thinking. In a sense, you can call it a failure of strategy because a crisis cannot have been foreseen. And a strategy should foresee all these things, but inevitably strategies are going to fail. So these things happen, and they happen seemingly with increasing frequency. The first thing I always think is really important is that you have to know what the crisis is about. And it takes me back to my youth flying Phantoms, where we used to have a stopwatch on the instrument panel, actually used for various things. It was a really good stopwatch for its day, but you had to wind it up. It's a clockwork one. And when we had an emergency in the cockpit, because you could suddenly start doing all sorts of things around the cockpit, you could actually make things worse. So wise old chap said to me, wise old pilot said to me in the crew room one day, when you have an emergency, wind the stopwatch. That's your first thing to do. I said, what the hell are you talking about? It's to stop and think. So you understand what you're going to do, what the emergency is, and you don't make it worse. And I think that's such a good parallel for a crisis. So how does that strike you? Does that sort of crack a chord?
I think that's a great example. I love it. It's, I mean, you're absolutely right about the nature of crises. On the one hand, we want to prepare for them. But on the other hand, what makes it a crisis is the fact that we are to some degree unprepared, right?
Yeah.
And I love that idea of time, because there is kind of a time element to this, isn't there?
Mm.
And I think from a leadership perspective, I mean, you'll know this with your background, and certainly I see this in kind of my research and coaching as well, is that there is no one way. But then we as leaders tend to take upon ourselves the ultimate responsibility of not only being action people, but also being oracles as well.
Yes.
As if there's some kind of toolbox or swag bag we can put our hands into and extract just the right thing to do in the right way that's both ethical and appropriate and everything else in that moment of crisis. And I love that image of the stopwatch will stay with me, because I think that idea of stopping and reflecting, but then actually giving yourself an opportunity to build the confidence to arrive in an optimal state to take on the challenge. That's the thing.
Yes.
So yeah, it does really resonate with me, that example.
It's quite good, because you've got to understand, what is the crisis. It won't be the last one. It may look like it, but it won't. And if you don't treat it in the way that with its own respect of the way that this crisis needs treating, you will make it worse. And that's the point of these things. But you make a really good point about that expectation on a leader in a crisis to have all the answers. And I like the word stupefaction, because this crisis is like the rabbit in the headlights for most people. They are stupefied by it. They're made stupid. And everybody turns around and looks at you in the crisis, and you've got to solve it. So the pressure put on a leader at this point is enormous, not just in the enormous amount of stuff and time that is going to pass through the leader's mind, desk, whatever, but that expectation, as you put it, of having the right answer, doing the ethical thing, to solve it all. And you really need to stand up in that moment. And that brings me to the second part, why I said actually it can bring out the worst in leadership, because you become the leader as hero. You become that charismatic, I have the answers person. And that's absolutely necessary at the beginning of a crisis. But you must step away from it, because if you don't, you make everybody depend upon you.
You're absolutely right. I agree. That really resonates with me on a lot of different levels. I call it the spotlight. That moment when you step onto stage, and, with my background, I remember walking onto the stage, the spot is there, it's the moment for your soliloquy. It's your time. And you know, everybody in the audience kind of knows 90% of what you're about to say. And if you fluff it or if you skip a line, it'll be catastrophic. At least that's how it feels.
Yes.
And that idea of stupefaction, it's not that you're stupid. It's that, in essence, that moment of vulnerability, I guess, that a crisis brings out of you, in that void, floods into you all the potential lapses, all the potential negative consequences, letting yourself down, letting your organization down, letting shareholders and stakeholders down, being judged, building a negative legacy, all flood into you. And no matter how charismatic you think you are, that seed of doubt is enough to take you one way or the other. I mean, I call it the crossroads when you meet a moment, and where there is ethics to contend with, but also the way that things are done around here. Do you make an ethical misjudgment in that moment for the good of the whole and be prepared to suffer the consequences of that? Or do you take stock, open it out? I mean, Keith Grint is fantastic on this, in talking about wicked problems. And, you know, this critical dimension, I think, is really important, because what we end up talking about is we have to give up a modicum of control and really be in the moment.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, the acknowledgement, and this is kind of my field and my strong belief, is that ultimately leadership is different from leader.
Yes. And
leadership is about us, not about me. And the sooner I recognize us as a leader, and the sooner I empower and devolve that responsibility so that I'm supported and engaged within a really healthy community of practice, the better. I mean, it's as simple as that. So the very nature, I think, of leadership is challenged by being in this crisis state. But absolutely, as you say, it may be appropriate to dive into that zone and to perform that role of being the point of the arrow. There are moments for that. The question is, where does it come from, I guess?
Well, the trust that you built up before it in people gives you the authority to be able to do it when it's necessary right at the start. But then, as you say, you quickly have to become part of that community practice of leadership rather than the leader. You need the leader at the beginning to get the ball rolling in the crisis, get people through that horrible moment when everything's going wrong. But then you need to move on, because this is absolutely in the areas of uncertainty and ambiguity, because you don't really know what the outcome of all this is going to be. It's often a real mess, and you've got to find your way through it. The best way to find through a mess is to engage everybody's mind. There's a lot to do. I called it the 3 Ps with dealing with ambiguity, uncertainty, and volatility. And the volatility is important, because if you're not quick on the uptake, things run away from you. But you can process it out, and that's the bit you do right at the beginning, the leader as hero stuff. You've got to give an answer, get people moving, starting to find the solution. Then you permit it to permeate. The second P, this is allowing people to see that it's not black and white. There isn't a singular answer, and all of them have a part to play in grabbing a piece of this and making things better. And you as the leader look around and go, yeah, that's working, not so much that one, so let's get rid of that. And then you help people move forward, and it's the people who are doing good work, you show other people that this is working right now. Let's go down that route a bit further, but not exclusively. And you can see the dead end and pull people out of it and help them to another place and give them the confidence that we can do something. The last P is profit from it. And the crisis is over, really, in some sort of negotiating terms. It's not. But this is about actually using ambiguity to your advantage. And in a crisis, the ambiguity comes. But this is more really away from the leader as the point of the spear, as you put it, as the hero, as the knowing the answers. It's where the leader doesn't have authority over everything that they're under. So it works in partnerships, in negotiations, etc., where you agree that that's the right direction of travel, but you don't know where you're going to end up. And an awful lot gets done than if you actually try and set targets, because not everybody can agree on the target. They can agree it's the right way to go, but they're not necessarily agree on the target. There are many examples of this sort of stuff. The negotiations in Northern Ireland was one where they agreed that decommissioning, getting rid of the weapons, was a good idea, but everybody's idea of what getting rid of the weapons actually meant was never ever defined, quite rightly, because you'd have never got agreement on it. They've got to sort of put theirs down a 3,000-foot mine shaft and cover them with concrete, but I'll just lock mine in the garden shed. No. We both need to get rid of them. And then you move step by step by step, and people have gone so far down the path that actually they can't get out of getting rid of the weapons anymore, and then get to a decent place. Whereas you'd never started if you'd actually tried to define what the end point of all this was. And there are many other ways in terms of partnership, true partnership, where there's no authority between two teams. But that's what helps me think through that movement from the I've got the answers to we need all work together, and that leadership as community, as you put it. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it does. It does. In a number of ways, and I love the 3 Ps because they're small words, but they have a lot of span in them. Thinking particularly about, I just thought about this idea of igniting and being a catalyst for those around you. And I know we've talked in the past about the nature of leadership and from our different perspectives, but the agreement that we had that empathy is a key to really making leadership communication. So leadership as practice, leadership as communication. When you go into the relational dynamics, when you're anchored by trust, when you know that those around you have your back, you have permission to fail, but fail better, in the words of Michael York, fail better.
Yeah.
But failure is not the end goal. And you realize that at a certain point that in all of this, whether it's moving quickly or slowly, we're all on the train together. And once it's left the station, we're together in it. And as long as it's moving, even if it's crawling along, you at certain points, you're going to find yourself in between stations, wondering if you're ever going to get to the next one. But as long as you're moving together and as long as you have each other's backs, then you've got a shot at it. Because I think, everything is kind of ambiguous in that you can frame the meaning of something in a variety of different ways. And that's why leadership mindset, this idea of mindset and reframing the way that you think, is so powerful, because on a psychological and cultural level, the way that you see the crisis, accept the crisis, and come at it with a solutions-based focus, that's the game changer. Because life happens, business happens, crises will happen, but you don't know whether somebody in your team is seeing it as a huge crisis and you're seeing it as a small crisis, or vice versa, particularly if you think your job's at stake, and then the person down the hall who's in the meeting room with you is not going to lose their jobs. We are human beings first and foremost, but ultimately it is about this idea of this collective empathy and finding a way to communicate through it with a solutions focus rather than a problems focused.
Absolutely. But not providing the solutions, it's allowing others to come up with them.
Exactly.
Because, your solution might work, but if there's enough good people out there that trust you, their solutions could be better. And it allows you then to step back as the leader and see a much bigger picture and all that's going on. But you use the word communication, and that to me is vital in this. It's so much internal communication that needs to be done by leaders at this point to explain what the crisis is, to explain what the processes are, get them moving in a singular direction that you've decided to start with, to communicate to them that it's okay to experiment and for them to start making up their own decisions and going places. Keep that communication going internally all the time. And there will be as well on the top leaders, you know, huge amounts of necessity to communicate externally during a crisis as well. So the communication load is vast.
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. And I'm going to come to a specific example that I do a workshop on in a moment. But the example that you gave about the decommissioning, etc., I think was a really useful one. And it's almost like concentric circles, isn't it? And you move from the outside to the inside through asking the right questions rather than coming up with the right answers. Sort of, I guess, taking responsibility for uplifting others around you so they can come into this leadership decision-making process and make contributions. That has a lot of benefits. It has cultural team benefits, it has organizational benefits, because one of the main factors that we see people in organizations struggle with is this idea of, is my contribution making a difference? Does my contribution make a difference? And I think within leadership, you have to help others around you to build an identity so that when the critical moment arrives, when the big moment arrives, when the adrenaline rush comes, and when you're in the zone, that you can be fully present. And like you say, that comes with trust and be able to delegate. But not just that, through your relationships with people prior to that event, have a sense of how people might make their contributions and delegate some of that responsibility. Make sure that those people feel the confidence to go, actually, I have something to say. I have a point. If people know that up front, then it becomes us rather than me. And I think a lot, to be honest with you, a lot of ethical lapses that come up, I think, are to do with what I call leadership altitude sickness. And do you know what I mean? The higher you ascend, don't look down.
Yeah, yeah, I do.
If you get to the mountaintop, you might feel great up there. The air might be slightly thin, but you've got a great view. But if you look down, you see how far you can fall.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think when people lapse from leadership and make different decisions, they're leading with the head and not with the gut, in a way. You can,
in a way, yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, the analogies all run out of steam eventually, but it's that bit about hanging on to be grounded in reality, that not being the altitude sickness getting to your head and stopping you really thinking these things through, because I'm always right, so I'm going to do this. Because leaders often are always right, but if they don't admit that they can ever be wrong, that's when it really goes badly wrong, and all these ethical mistakes get done, but not usually out of deliberate malice or poor thinking. It's because they've lost touch with that base, that reality. And you're so right that they need to be able to listen to grab onto that base. But you have to work at the culture to allow people to speak up freely. Because, I mean, you know, I've heard people say, tell me anything. Well, that's all right if you believe it. But unless they believe it, it's not going to happen. And if they don't believe they can speak up honestly, they will never speak up honestly. And this is where the trust in you and the creation of the culture, and that culture may be time bound. It may be, well, this is the time to do it, but not this. And that's really important in crisis, because you often at the beginning, you don't have time to question or to answer all the questions. You just need people to get on and do what you ask. But very shortly after, you need people to stand up and say, have you thought about this? And you have to listen. And that transition can be really hard for people, even if you've got the culture. Sorry.
Absolutely. No, 100%. I think you're right. And, you know, I think part of it is to do with kind of ego in a way.
Yeah.
I think the way we construct or think of leadership as a society is problematic in light of what we're saying is appropriate here. We look for charisma. We look for top level qualifications. We look for people that knock it out the park, who hit a 6 on every ball. We look for people that make it look easy, that make us feel as if we're not quite up to their standard. And we build the sense within people as a society that they are infallible, that whatever decision that they make is the right decision because they are who they are, and it's them making the decision. It's kind of, you know, it's a superhero complex. So we're going from hero to superhero. And then you have problems when people believe that whatever they do is the right decision without thinking, without reflecting, without inviting other views or suggestions. And, you know, some of it has to do with how you co-construct, how you co-create that sort of curriculum that you're following as an organization. What are we about? Okay, how do I fit into what we are about? Are we moving along together? Are we co-creating this thing together such that it belongs to everybody? Or are we simply waiting for other people to tell us what to do? And if people don't feel empowered, how are they going to contribute to what we're talking about when the organization and frankly, when society needs them? I did I do a workshop all about ethics and about the gray area of ethics, frankly. And we look at the oil industry and other industries where crises have happened. And role play is a fantastic device in this, in the classroom setting. And working with people who are confirmed non-actors and put them in these situations, very quickly they get into it. And then they reflect afterwards as to how much empathy they have for people that have been in these situations as well. So it goes beyond blame and shame to actually a felt sense of actually how complex and how difficult leadership is in the field. And, you know, how, you know, we are quick to judge as a society. There are complexities out there. There are problems out there as well. But the nature of leadership, I think sometimes from people who feel outside looking in, is that leadership is not for them and neither do they want it. I mean, I've coached people who've said to me, one person in particular, she said to me, you know, I don't think of myself as a leader. And everybody else could see it, including me. And it's because she'd been in environments where she wasn't really asked her opinion necessarily, but it wasn't that she was excluded. It's just that she looked around how leadership was being performed. The exercise of leadership around them was very, very big, bold, alpha, and knowing, certain. And the uncertainty as somebody who was not certain made her feel like, oh, that's for them. That leadership thing, that's for them, and they're very good at it. I'm sort of in awe. But that's not for me. I can only just get on with my job. And when I asked her about herself, she said she rattled off a chronological list of all her achievements, one by one, which were great. But she's still given the very best business presentation I've ever seen in my life, and I've seen a lot. And during our coaching, we talked about that and talked about this idea of how we construct an identity within ourselves. So it is the communication out, but it's also the communication in. That's another element of it, I think.
It is, and it's, you said at the beginning, leadership's very individual. It is, and for that person that you were just talking about, she doesn't have to lead like other people lead. She would be a good leader. She has the authority by being exceptional at what she does. And she is that sort of person who would listen to others and see what was going on around her. You quite clearly explained that. That's a great way to lead.
Yeah.
And gains trust of people hand over fist. You don't have to have all the answers. You do at the beginning of the crisis have to have an answer. Might not be the right one at the end of the day. It doesn't matter. You've just got to get going and do something to keep the ship afloat, or whatever analogy you wish to use. But you've got to get people going, inspire them to get going. And someone who would have the trust of their people, that woman clearly would have, is just that sort of person to have the trust, to say in the moment, and by gum, it would be hard for her to do this, but let's do this. And everybody starts, and then she can listen to everybody and do what she's really good at and really get the right answer. Whereas there are others who are so good, as the leaders you described around her, who would be really good at the let's do this, but they would not be so good at letting go of that if it wasn't quite doing what it should. And that's where leadership failure and leadership poorness can really come in. So she sounds like a brilliant person to me.
Yeah, she was a real inspiration for me. I met her very early in my career and she really inspired me. But then I thought to myself, why doesn't she see what I'm seeing? And it's interesting, you know, all that you say. And, you know, I mean, from my perspective, it's, you know, it's really interesting that, you know, you have to have an answer, but to hold on to it jealously, or to think that if somebody disagrees or there's a critical voice, or frankly, an experienced and knowledgeable voice in the room, that to acknowledge that you're not quite there, or you haven't quite got it, or that it can be continuously improved as a train of thought.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Is again coming back to this idea of the ego. And I'm not just talking about it from a toxic perspective. I'm talking about the ego from the perspective that, well, I am what it says on the business card. I can't reach out. I can't ask for help. I can't say I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't be corrected in front of all these people because I'm the top dog. And as the top dog, what does that say about me? That means I'm worthless and useless. And the self-talk, I think, that can come out of that situation is very much there. I was on a call the other day, and we were talking about, I think we were talking about education and leadership education. And I was corrected by somebody, or somebody put my point in a more succinct and actually better fashion. And, you know, it was odd because I acknowledged that had taken place. But it's, and I actually thought to myself, well, I'll write that down. But I might just as well have thought, oh, here we go. Okay, I'm out now. I'm not going to speak again because 20 people in this room all think I'm useless and I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm supposed to know what I'm talking about. This is my field, and all that judgment. And I think if we're trying to navigate crisis and uncertainty and frankly complexity, as leaders, if we take it away from authority and power, then we're talking about actually acknowledging that there's some vulnerability here. And the openness and the trust and the listening, again, when you mentioned listening, I think is a key dynamic in creating a really holistic place from which you can constantly question and critically evaluate. I mean, it's like when I'm teaching students or when I'm lecturing, I always frame it in terms of a conversation, because I think all information should be a conversation. And I start off by saying, look, I may know my field, but that doesn't make me the expert here. I am here not just to impart knowledge to you, you're here to impart knowledge to me. By the end of it, hopefully we've all learned something and moved ahead, and we have some questions that are worth answering about what we're here to talk about. And
yeah, absolutely. And isn't that so good? And I love your self-talk thing, because it's so right. And it's so difficult to get the balance between the self-talk that makes you very confident and the self-talk that makes you underconfident. Overdo one and you can make those awful mistakes that you just didn't see coming. overdo the other, and you can talk yourself out of a job internally, but actually externally with all the people around you, because people do look to you. You don't have to have all the answers. You're human, just like everybody else, but you don't have to have some of the answers. And of course, mistakes. You can make mistakes, but don't make the same one twice.
That's right. Be present.
Yeah.
Be attentive.
Yeah.
And be intentional. Think to yourself, okay, let me take that on board. Let me learn for it. Because everything, if you frame it in that way, is a learning experience. And, you know, I've been on stage plenty of times and forgotten my lines, lost my place and everything else. But I think the thing is to say that we all have a backstory. And if you get into the position, and I started to take this advice myself after being quite a perfectionist and quite hard on myself sort of early on in my life, is to say that it's all feedback. So, you know, what is it that my coach says? Extend yourself some grace.
Yes.
And know that there is no perfection in this. There is just your best effort and where we are now.
Yes.
And you're right about self-talk. And I think that's the dangerous thing about it, is it can be a precipice.
Mm.
And, you know, a tightrope walker can walk along something wafer thin. Someone else might fall if the thing's a meter wide.
Yes, quite.
And there's a fine line between talking yourself out of it. And, you know, I have a special interest in diversity, inclusion, and equity, and how leadership can become more inclusive. And I've spoken to many, many people who have talked themselves out of potential opportunities by making an assumption, whatever that's based on, that it's not the place for me. I can't thrive there. They won't have me. Whether that's somebody who has a protected characteristic, somebody who's coming back into work after a long time. Confidence can be fragile. That's why it's so important to be surrounded by people that have got your back, people who understand you and your particular needs and accept you as who you are. That's ultimately a great place from which to come and stumble and fall. Babies fall over, they scuff their knees. What do? They just sit down and grow up on their backsides? No, they get up and they have another go, and they keep going, they work it out. Every time they fall, the brain's rewiring and saying, okay, if I do that, let me try that. Oh, that didn't work. Okay. Oh, this is the way. Okay, right. That level is reached. Now I'm on to level 2. That's how you learn. You don't learn, and this is the neuroscience, you don't learn by being perfect all the time. You don't fulfill your potential that way. You only learn, and your brain rewires to make you great at something through adjusting around failure. That's what, and I think if in our education system and within our society in general, we were more allowing of that growth that leadership comes from, I think we'd be in a great place.
I think you're right, and you're absolutely right. We learn through failure more than we learn through success, but we do fail to learn from success. And I think it's probably for exactly that reason. It's done. You've done it. Well, I don't need to learn anything about that, but you can go back, look, see where it went well, because there will be times when it didn't go so well. So learning from success is really important in leadership, but it's harder to do. You will learn from failure as long as that voice doesn't say this isn't for you anymore, and that you've got to bolster it with the confident one on the other side to help you go forward. And we're lucky because we can actually get vicarious experience through other people.
100%.
As leadership, you can see where other people make mistakes and go, I must avoid that one. You're never going to be quite them, but you can see where they've gone wrong and say, okay, I can adapt. I can make sure I don't make that mistake. And
exactly.
I think leaders need to do all these things. And you used the word, that reflective space earlier on. That is so important, to give yourself time to reflect on what has happened.
Exactly. And there's so many different layers to reflection as well. And, you know, I agree 100% with what you said. But it's possible to come in with a reflective sort of mindset. So being open to learning, I think, is a big piece of that. And I love what you said about this idea of failing to learn from success.
Yeah.
I love that sentence. I need to put it on a t-shirt or something. It'd be a great t-shirt caption. But it's so spot on, because I think in a lot of instances, you know, the real trick, I guess, is in reflecting on that success. What happened? What went wrong? Or rather, what could go better? What went well? How can you continue to improve? But also not getting stuck and tied into what went right. I don't know, for instance, you know, if you play competitive sport or something, and you play what you recognize as a perfect game, and it was a certain formation and certain dynamics, and say you're a coach of this side, do you just get fixed in that and say, we played this team and this is how we won, this is what we do? Or do you reflect on that, look for opportunities for change, and then treat the very next game as new opposition? And I think, you know, for in a lot of instances, I think, you know, you can get a very sort of fixed mindset around success and get really stuck and say, this worked, this is it, we're not budging, we're not moving, and plant your feet. The problem with planting your feet is it makes you brittle.
Yes.
And that's the same for individuals, that's the same for teams and everybody else, because what we're talking about here is change.
Mm.
And what you're doing by planting your feet is you're resisting change, and change is happening. We're seeing it. We saw it in the music industry 20 years ago. We're seeing it now in general society around AI and all the new technologies that are coming out. This is happening. Mm. Life is happening. You know, time doesn't stop. I mean, the stopwatch has been set. We're moving now. So the question is, what do we do in light of this change? How do we keep abreast of it? How do we make it our own? How do we learn from it rather than constantly resisting it? And I think then you get the accompanying vulnerability that comes when we enter these situations of complexity and risk, which is, you know, something that, you know, my research looks at. And do you have appropriate confidence and identity to meet the challenge where it is? I mean, I've read quite a bit about stage fright, you know, from my background, you know, as a performer in the past. And I read an interesting article which said, and this relates to risk as well, and to ambiguity. A great academic said, you can look at stage fright as being crippling, or you can look at it as a reframing of excitement. So actually, when you look at the brain, your brain can't tell the difference between a crisis and an opportunity. It's there as a filter to protect you, mainly based on your prior experience. So the regions of the brain that fire up when you have crippling stage fright are exactly the same regions of the brain that fire up when you're excited and can't wait to get going. That idea of, you know, I used to play rugby. Just when you stepped onto the field and the opposition were there and you're just getting ready for kickoff, that. And it's a tiny thing, but it is something
that
you
first
can
contact is frightening. Yeah, absolutely.
First contact is critical, because that gives you the confidence to get stuck in, and whatever will be, but you know you've left it all on the field.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a really good analogy, and you're right. And it's that ability to take that within you and reframe it and use it to your own advantage. I mean, I was always told about it for public speaking, which I suppose is analogous for most of us to what you used to do. Not on quite such a grand scale, of course, but that the flutters in your tummy and the frightening part of getting up there, the adrenaline flow, you can harness that and use it to your advantage. And getting over it, not making it, oh, I can't do this type feeling, which you could easily allow yourself to pitchfork into, but saying, oh yeah, this is exciting. So yeah, I love that. I think that's really good.
And you know, it's about, and in public speaking, you know, I've done a lot of it. I've done keynotes, I've done a lot of presentations and teaching. And I've been thrown into some situations where they go, oh, you'll say a few words, won't you? Here's the microphone. Just go up 5 minutes, just talk about
Because
stuff.
you can, you're an actor.
Just say, yeah, because you kind of got the gift of the gab, and just, can you just fill in while we get some technical stuff sorted out and go on stage? And I've even been asked to sing on stage live with 10 minutes.
Oh my
notice.
goodness, rather you than me.
Yeah, a Luther Vandross song as well. And I tell you, Luther Vandross is not easy to sing. Hopefully I didn't make too much of a hash of it, but but this is the thing about it, is that I would go a stage further and say that the butterflies are necessary.
Yeah.
Because I think that the good stuff comes from the butterflies, where they're situated. So that feeling of ultra laser focus, that factor which can be framed as fear, can be framed as opportunity. So when I go on stage, there's always a moment when I get up there, even when things are going wrong, when the Zoom has crashed and when people are saying, I can't hear you, and when the people in the room, I'm asking them a question, nothing's happening, when I can't get my notes sorted, there's a kind of moment of clarity that comes from that, where you check in with yourself and you reflect and say, I got this. I've got this. Whatever this is, I've got it. And you see that actually, as my old drama school head of acting used to say, if you can't fail here, where can you fail?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Where it's like, people are not here to see you fall. They're here to see you rise.
Yeah.
You're there for a reason.
That realization that in the audience, people want you to succeed.
Absolutely. Just go out there and connect. Be yourself. Trust your right to be there. Have this moment and be in this moment. Don't worry about what happened yesterday. Tomorrow is uncertain. You need to be present. You need to be here now and engage with people. Don't look for who's smiling and who's acknowledging you. Don't make the presentation about you. Make it about the material. You are ready because you're there.
Yeah, and that's so much like leadership.
Yeah, just do it. Just do it.
Yeah.
Because there's
people
no
want
way
you to succeed.
Absolutely, they want you to succeed, and for and it's important, and you're there for a reason. As long as you make it about the reason and not about yourself, you're in a much better place.